As soon as Brian Fitzgerald received the telegram which announced the death of Mark Frettlby, he went down to St. Kilda with Colton. On arrival they found the whole house perfectly quiet and orderly, owing to the excellent management of Sal Rawlins. "She's a clever girl, Nat," whispered the lawyer to Fitzgerald. "Curious thing she should have taken up her proper position in her father's house. Fate is a deal cleverer than we mortals think her." Brian was about to reply when Dr. Chinston entered the room. His face was grave. "Miss Frettlby is very ill. She has an attack of brain fever. I can't answer for the consequences yet." Brian sat down on the sofa and stared at the doctor in a dazed sort of way, his heart being too full to speak. "How did Frettlby die?" asked Colton. "This young woman will tell you all about it." Chinston nodded towards Sal, who entered the room at this moment. "I must go." He shook hands with Colton and Fitzgerald. "Keep up your heart, my boy. I'll pull her through yet." After the doctor had departed, Colton turned to Sal Rawlins. "Well, can you tell us what happened?" "I can, sir. But we had better go up to the study." "Why?" "Because, sir, I don't want anyone but yourselves to hear what I'm going to say." They entered the study, and Colton took his seat at the desk. Sal locked the door. "Mr. Frettlby went to bed early last night. Miss Madge and I were talking together in the drawing-room when he entered, walking in his sleep and carrying an envelope." Both Colton and Fitzgerald started, and the latter grew pale. "He opened it and spread out a paper on the table. Miss Madge bent forward to see what it was. I tried to stop her, but it was too late. She gave a scream and fell on the floor. In doing so, she happened to touch her father. He awoke and fell down dead." "And the paper?" Sal did not answer, but producing it from her pocket, laid it in his hands. Brian bent forward, and both men gave vent to an exclamation of horror. The lawyer eyed Sal keenly. "You know what this is?" "I could hardly help knowing. It proves that Rosanna Moore was Mr. Frettlby's wife." For a moment no one spoke. "You needn't think I'm going to tell. I know what you know, but I'll be as silent as the grave." Brian fervently took her hand. "Thank you." "It'd be a nice end around on Miss Madge after her lifting me out of the gutter. A poor girl like me, without a friend or a relative, now Gran's dead." Colton looked up quickly. It was plain that Sal was quite ignorant that Rosanna Moore was her mother. So much the better. "I'm going to Miss Madge now. I'll not let anyone in but myself." And so saying, she left the room. Suddenly Colton exclaimed in surprise, and, turning hastily, Brian saw him holding a thick roll of papers which he had taken out of the desk drawer. "Look here, Fitzgerald. Here is Frettlby's confession." Brian sprang forward. So at last the Hansom Cab mystery was to be cleared up. These sheets, no doubt, contained the whole narration of the crime and how it was committed. "We will read it, of course." But he was half hoping that Colton would propose to destroy it at once. "The 3 executors of Frettlby's will must read it." "Who are they?" "Myself, yourself, and Dr. Chinston. We shall read it, and then we shall burn it." "Good. Frettlby is dead, and the law can do nothing in the matter, so it would be best to avoid the scandal of publicity. But why tell Chinston?" "He will be sure to gather some of the truth from Madge's fevered ravings, and he may as well know everything. He is quite safe and will be silent. But I am more sorry to tell Kilsip." "The detective? Good God, Colton, surely you will not do so." "I must. Kilsip is firmly persuaded that Roger Morland committed the crime, and I have the same dread of his pertinacity as you had of mine. He may find out all. I will telegraph to him and the doctor to come up to my office this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and then we will settle the whole matter." Dr. Chinston had received Colton's telegram and was considerably astonished thereat. He was still more so when, on arriving at the office at the time appointed, he found Colton and Fitzgerald were not alone, but a third man, whom he had never seen, was with them. The latter Colton introduced to him as Mr. Kilsip of the detective office, a fact which made the worthy doctor uneasy, as he could in no wise divine the meaning of it. Colton looked at him. "Doctor, do you remember the Hansom Cab murder which caused such a sensation some months ago?"
"Yes, I do."
"Well, the fact is, Mr. Frettlby was implicated in the affair." "What do you mean? How was he implicated?" The lawyer turned to Kilsip. "Your hunt after Roger Morland is a wild goose chase, for the murderer of Oliver White is discovered. This is his confession, and his name is Mark Frettlby." The doctor pushed back his chair furiously and arose to his feet. "This is monstrous! I won't sit still and hear this accusation against my dead friend." Kilsip smiled and dragged a bundle from under his chair. "If you are right, what about this?" And he held up a light coat very much soiled and weather-worn. "Whose is that?" asked Colton, startled. "Not White's?" "Yes, White's. I found it in the Fitzroy Gardens. It was hidden up in a fir tree." He took a small bottle out of the pocket of the coat and held it up. "I also found this." "Chloroform!" cried everyone, guessing at once that it was the missing bottle. "Exactly. This was the bottle which contained the poison. The name of the chemist being on the label, I went to him and found out who bought it. Now, who do you think that was?" "Frettlby," said Colton decidedly. "No, Morland," burst out Chinston. "Neither. The man who purchased this was Oliver White himself." "He bought it himself?" "Yes, on the very day he was murdered. The chemist had recorded the sale in his poisons book." "And what did he buy it for?" "That's more than I can tell you. It's down in the book as being bought for medicinal uses, which may mean anything." "The law requires a witness," observed Colton. "Who was the witness?" Again Kilsip smiled triumphantly. "Roger Morland." "This is a lot of nonsense. There's nothing against Morland to implicate him. If he killed White, what made him go and see Frettlby?" "What's the good of all this conjecturing?" said Chinston, now thoroughly tired of the discussion. "Read the confession and we'll soon know the truth, without all this talk." Colton assented, and all having settled themselves to listen, he began to read what the dead man had written. "What I am now about to write is set forth by me so that the true circumstances connected with the Hansom Cab tragedy may be known. In order to account for the murder of Oliver White, I must go back to the beginning of my time in this country and show how the series of events began which culminated in the committal of the crime." There then followed a long and detailed account of Mark Frettlby's early life, first as a clerk in London, then as a determined young man in the rising colony of Melbourne, where he steadily grew both in riches and reputation. He wrote of his love of the great open country, and equally of the wild, gregarious, bohemian life of the town. At length, Colton found himself reading of events and names well known to his listeners. It was at one of those charming suppers, at which wit and humour reigned supreme, that I first met the burlesque actress Rosanna Moore. There was a brilliancy and fascination about her which few could resist, and I ended by falling desperately in love with her. I determined to make her my wife. It was on condition, however, that the marriage should be kept secret until such time as I should choose to reveal it. My father was still alive, and he being a rigid Presbyterian and old and feeble, I feared that the shock would be too much for him. As I was rich, young, and not bad-looking, Rosanna consented. She never told her mother she had married me. Why, I do not know, as I laid no restriction on her doing so. The mother made a great noise when her daughter moved away from their home together, but I gave Rosanna a large sum of money for her, and this the old harridan accepted. Rosanna went with me to my sheep station, but eventually grew weary of the quiet country life and longed to return to the glitter and glare of the footlights. A child was born, and for a time she was engrossed with it, but soon wearied of the new plaything and pressed me to allow her to go back to the stage. This I refused to do, and we became estranged from one another. There was a great friend of mine who owned the next station, a fine, handsome young fellow called Frank Kelly. Thinking Rosanna was only my mistress, he began to console her, and succeeded so well that one day, on my return from a ride, I found she had fled with him and had taken the child with her. She left a letter saying that she had never really cared for me, but had married me for my money. She swore she would keep our marriage secret, and told me she was going to return to the stage in England. Disgusted with the manner in which I had been treated, I plunged into a whirl of dissipation, trying to drown the memory of my married life. I was arrested upon the brink of destruction by an angel. I say this advisedly, for if ever there was an angel upon earth, it was she who afterwards became my wife. At this second crisis of my life, fate again intervened, for I received a letter from England which informed me that Rosanna Moore had been run over in the streets of London and had died. The writer was a young doctor who had attended her. I began to look forward to the future. I married again, and my domestic life was a singularly happy one. When my dear daughter Margaret was born, I felt that my cup of happiness was full. But suddenly I received a disagreeable reminder of the past. Rosanna's mother made her appearance one day, a disreputable-looking creature smelling of gin. She had spent long ago all the money I had given her. I asked after the child, and she told me it was dead. Rosanna had not taken it to England with her, but had left it in her mother's charge, and no doubt neglect and want of proper nourishment was the cause of its death. There now seemed to be no link to bind me to the past, with the exception of the old hag, and she knew nothing about the marriage. I did not attempt to undeceive her, but agreed to allow her enough to live on if she promised never to trouble me again, and to keep quiet about everything which had reference to my connection with her daughter. As years rolled on, things prospered with me, and so fortunate was I in all speculations that my luck became proverbial. Then, alas, when all things seemed to smile upon me, my wife died, and the world has never seemed the same to me since. But I had my dear daughter to console me, and in her love and affection I became reconciled to the loss of my wife. Then, suddenly, a series of events occurred which must be fresh in the memory of those who read these pages. Mr. Oliver White, a gentleman from London, called on me and startled me with the news that my first wife, Rosanna Moore, was still living, and that the story of her death had been an ingenious fabrication in order to deceive me. White met her in London, and she became his mistress. Her popularity being on the wane, as she was now growing old and had to make way for younger actresses, White proposed that they should proceed to the colonies and extort money from me. He had come to me for that purpose. The villain told me all this in the coolest manner. I asked him his terms, which were first, a large sum of money was to be paid to Rosanna, and secondly, that he should marry my daughter. I absolutely declined to sanction the latter proposal, but as he threatened to publish the story, and that meant the proclamation to the world of my daughter's illegitimacy, I at last agreed, and he began to pay his addresses to Madge. She, however, refused to marry him, and told me she was engaged to a fine young man named Brian Fitzgerald. So, after a severe struggle with myself, I told White that I would not allow him to marry Madge. On the night he was murdered, he came to see me, and showed me the certificate of marriage between myself and Rosanna Moore. He said that unless I consented to his marriage with Madge, he would publish the whole affair. I was in despair, and saw that the only way to save myself was to obtain possession of the marriage certificate and deny everything. With this idea in my mind, I followed him up to town and saw him meet Roger Moreland and drink with him. They went into the hotel in Russell Street, and when White came out at 12:30, he was quite intoxicated. I thought I would then be able to get the certificate from him, but I saw a gentleman in a light coat, I did not then know it was Fitzgerald, come up to him and hail a cab for him. I saw there was nothing more to be done at that time, so in despair I went home and waited for the next day, in fear lest White should carry out his determination and expose me. Nothing, however, turned up. I was beginning to think that White had abandoned his purpose, when I heard that he had been murdered in the Hansom Cab. I was in great fear lest the marriage certificate should be found on him, but nothing was said about it. This I could not understand at all. I knew he had it on him, and I could only conclude that the murderer, whoever he was, had taken it from the body, and would sooner or later come to me to extort money, knowing that I dare not denounce him. I was right. For 2 nights ago, Roger Moreland called on me and produced the marriage certificate, which he offered to sell to me for £5,000. I accused him of murdering White, which he denied at first, but afterwards acknowledged, stating that I dare not betray him for my own sake. I was nearly mad with the horror I was placed in, either to denounce my daughter as illegitimate, or let a murderer escape the penalty of his crime. At last I agreed to keep silent, and handed Moreland a cheque for £5,000, receiving in return the marriage certificate. I then made him swear to leave the colony, which he readily agreed to do, saying Melbourne was dangerous. When he left, I reflected upon the awfulness of my position, and I almost determined to commit suicide, but thank God I was saved from that crime. I write this confession in order that after my death the true story of the murder of Oliver White may be known, and that anyone who may hereafter be accused of the murder may not be wrongfully punished. I will not destroy the marriage certificate, but place it with these papers so that the truth of my story can be seen. In conclusion, I would ask forgiveness of my daughter Margaret for my sins, which have been visited on her, but she can see for herself that circumstances were too strong for me. May she forgive me, as I hope God in his infinite mercy will, and may she come sometimes and pray over my grave, nor think too hardly upon her dead father. Colton laid the manuscript down on the table amid a dead silence, which was first broken by Brian. Thank God. Thank God that he was innocent of the crime. Kilsip purred to himself in a satisfied sort of way, like a cat who has caught a mouse. "You see, sir," he addressed the barrister, "I was right after all. I'm going to arrest Moreland right off." "But he will confess everything," said Colton, "and then everyone will know about Frettleby's first marriage and what it means." "Let them," said Brian. "As soon as Madge is well enough, we will marry at once and leave Australia forever. Arrest the murderer, and let him pay for his crime." Colton turned to the detective. "You have been watching Moreland?" "I have indeed." "Then do you know if he has yet cashed that cheque for £5,000 which Frettleby gave him?" "He's been to his bank, but with Mr. Frettleby's death I expect the cheque has not yet been honoured. The manager no doubt told him he'd better see the executors." The lawyer broke in impatiently. "But the manager doesn't know who the executors are." "Then he'd have told him to go to the late Mr. Frettleby's solicitors. I suppose he knows who they are." "Thinton and Tarbet. I'll tell you what. There's a chance Moreland won't have seen them yet. I'll go across the way and telephone to them." In about 10 minutes, Colton rushed back in. "Fate is playing into our hands. Moreland called on Thinton and Tarbet, but neither of them was in, and he said he would call again before 5 o'clock. I told the clerk to bring him here to me." "A very good idea," said Kilsip, rubbing his hands. "And then I can arrest him." It was getting a little dusk, and the four men were greatly excited, though they concealed it under an assumed nonchalance. Kilsip was seated in his chair, humming an operatic air and chinking his handcuffs together by way of accompaniment. He felt intensely pleased with himself, the more so as he saw that by this capture he would be ranked far above his detested rival, Inspector Gorby. Then steps were heard echoing on the flags outside. Colton motioned for silence. Kilsip arose from his chair. Just as he did so, there was a knock at the door, and in response to Colton's invitation to enter, Thinton and Tarbet's clerk came in with Roger Morland. The latter faltered a little on the threshold when he saw Colton was not alone, but pulled himself together and advanced into the room in an easy and confident manner.
"This is the gentleman who wants to know about the cheque, sir," said the clerk to Colton.
"Oh, indeed. I'm glad to see him. You can go." The clerk bowed and went out, closing the door after him. Suddenly, Morland shrieked. "What's that?" He grew pale as he saw White's coat, all weather-stained, lying on a chair near him.
"That is the rope that's going to hang you," said Kilsip, coming up behind him, "for the murder of Oliver White."
Morland gasped. "Trapped, by God!" He wheeled round and sprang at the detective's throat, but the latter was too strong for him, and after a sharp struggle he succeeded in getting the handcuffs on Morland's wrists. The others stood around perfectly quiet, knowing that Kilsip required no assistance. Morland regarded them sullenly. "You can't prove anything." Colton touched the confession. "You are wrong. This is the confession of Mark Frettlby, made before he died." Morland's face grew white. I see that it's all up with me. So I'm not going to lie like a coward. I've played for a big stake and lost. But I don't know that I'm sorry about it. I've had a hell upon earth since I killed White. Then you acknowledge your guilt? It was White's own fault. When I met him that night, he told me the story and showed me the marriage certificate. I thought if I could only get it, I'd make a nice little pile out of Frettlby over it. So when White went on drinking, I did not. After he had gone out of the hotel, I put on the coat he had left behind and followed him. Colton regarded him. "And the cab driver took you for Mr. Fitzgerald? By wearing that coat you very nearly hanged an innocent man." Morland turned to Brian. "I swear I had no idea of murdering White when I got into the cab. I tried to get the document, but he wouldn't let me. Then I thought of the chloroform in the pocket of his coat. He went off after a few minutes. I thought he was only insensible, and it was only when I saw the newspapers that I knew he was dead." He fell down in a chair with an air of utter weariness. "No man can be stronger than destiny. I have lost, and you have won. We are the puppets of fate." Fitzgerald was calm, but it was the calmness of despair. The misfortunes of the past year seemed to have come to a climax, and he looked forward to the publication of the whole bitter story with an indifference that surprised himself. His own name and that of Madge and her dead father would be on every tongue, yet he felt perfectly callous to whatever might be said on the subject. The public curiosity, however, was destined never to be gratified. For the next day it was known that Roger Morland had hanged himself in his cell during the night, and had left no confession behind him. When Brian heard this, he breathed a heartfelt prayer of thanks for his deliverance, and went to see Colton, whom he found at his chambers in deep conversation with Chinston and Kilsip. They all came to the conclusion that as Morland was now dead, nothing could be gained by publishing the confession of Mark Frettlby, so agreed to burn it. And when Fitzgerald saw the heap of blackened paper in the fireplace, he felt a weight lifted off his heart. After several consultations with Colton, Brian at last came to the conclusion that it would be useless to reveal to Sal Rawlins the fact that she was Mark Frettlby's daughter. By the will, the money was clearly left to Madge, and such a revelation could bring Sal no pecuniary benefit, while her bringing up unfitted her for the position. So a yearly income, more than sufficient for her wants, was settled upon her, and she was allowed to remain in ignorance of her parentage. The influence of her old life, however, was very strong on her, and she devoted herself to the task of saving her fallen sisters. Knowing as she did all the intricacies of the slums, she was enabled to do an immense amount of good, and many an unhappy woman was saved from the squalor and hardship of a gutter life by the kind hand of Sal Rawlins. Madge slowly recovered from her illness. On her recovery, she learned the story of her father's early marriage, but both Colton and Fitzgerald were silent about the fact of Sal Rawlins being her half-sister, as such a revelation could do no good and would only create a scandal. Shortly afterwards, Madge married Fitzgerald, and both of them only too gladly left Australia, with all its sorrows and bitter memories. Standing with her husband on the deck of one of the P&O steamers as it ploughed the blue waters of Hobson's Bay into foam, they both watched Melbourne gradually fade from their view under the glow of the sunset. They could see the two great domes of the Exhibition and the Law Courts, and also Government House, with its tall tower rising from the midst of the green trees. In the background was a bright crimson sky, barred with masses of black clouds, and over all the great city hung a cloud of smoke like a pall. The flaring red light of the sinking sun glared angrily on the heavy waters, and the steamer seemed to be making its way through a sea of blood. Madge, clinging to her husband's arm, felt her eyes fill with tears as she saw the land of her birth receding slowly. "Goodbye. Goodbye forever." "You do not regret?" "Regret? No. With you by my side, I fear nothing. Surely our hearts have been tried in the furnace of affliction, and our love has been chastened and purified." Brian bent down and kissed her. The great steamer moved slowly out to sea, and as they stood on the deck, hand clasped in hand, with the fresh salt breeze blowing keenly in their faces, it bore them away into the placid beauty of the coming night, towards the old world and the new life.